One number quietly revealed just how dramatically the Minnesota Vikings have changed their strategy, and it is a number that many fans probably did not expect to see. After a year in which the organization pushed hard to build an aggressive roster through major free agent investments, the franchise has now swung in the complete opposite direction. The Vikings reportedly spent only $53 $73 million in free agency this offseason, the lowest total in the entire NFL, a stunning contrast to the approach that defined the previous year. That figure alone tells a fascinating story about where this team is headed. While everyone knew Minnesota would not be among the league's biggest spenders because of salary cap limitations, few expected them to finish dead last in total spending. Around the league, organizations such as the Titans, Raiders, Commanders, Colts, Panthers, Giants, and Saints opened their wallets and attacked free agency aggressively. Minnesota chose a different path. Let's analyze all the details, but first, click the like button and write some comments. How long have you been a Vikings fan? I want to know. And the reason becomes clearer when looking back at what happened during the previous spending cycle. The Vikings entered that period believing they could maximize the advantages of a young quarterback contract by surrounding the roster with proven veterans. The vision was straightforward: build a contender around a quarterback who was not consuming a massive percentage of the salary cap. On paper, it looked like a logical strategy, but football is ultimately judged by results. Several of the major additions from that spending spree failed to deliver the impact the organization hoped for. Some players battled injuries. Others never became ideal fits within the system. Several contracts that once looked like bold moves are now being viewed through a much different lens. That reality appears to have influenced the franchise's current approach. Instead of chasing headlines with blockbuster signings, Minnesota focused on value. Every dollar suddenly mattered. Every contract needed flexibility. Every acquisition had to fit a specific role. The result is a roster-building philosophy that feels much more calculated. The Vikings now have a starting quarterback playing on an incredibly affordable contract. They added veteran depth at key positions without committing enormous long-term resources. Rather than making one or two splash moves, the front office targeted players who could potentially outperform their contracts. That shift may not generate off-season championship banners on social media, but it could prove far more sustainable if the evaluations are correct. And while the spending numbers generated attention, they were not the only developments taking place inside the organization. Over the last 24 hours, Minnesota also made 4 roster moves that could easily fly under the radar but are worth monitoring. The club moved on from Caleb Beating and Munkle Goodwine, while bringing in tight end Marshall Lang and defensive lineman Jafari Ritzie. At first glance, these transactions may seem like standard off-season roster churn. However, there are details here that could become important later in training camp. Marshall Lang arrives as a physically imposing tight end with experience in the New England Patriots system. Standing 6'4" and weighing approximately 252 pounds, Lang built his reputation primarily as a blocking tight end during his college career at Northwestern. His production numbers were modest, but that was never his primary responsibility. He was used as a physical presence in the run game, a role that remains valuable in today's NFL despite the growing emphasis on passing offenses. The challenge for Lang will be climbing a crowded depth chart. Several tight ends already have established positions within the Vikings' plans, meaning the most realistic path could initially involve the practice squad. Still, history has shown that developmental players can quickly become relevant when injuries occur or opportunities emerge. And that brings us to perhaps the more intriguing addition. Jafari Ritzie may not be a household name today, but he possesses the type of physical traits that NFL evaluators consistently gamble on. The former North Carolina defensive lineman stands roughly 6'4" and weighs close to 300 pounds. He also posted athletic testing numbers that stand out for a player of his size. More importantly, he combined those physical tools with meaningful production at the collegiate level. Across his career, Ritzie accumulated tackles, sacks, tackles for loss, forced fumbles, and even an interception. Those numbers alone do not guarantee success at the professional level, but they suggest there is developmental upside worth exploring. The road to a roster spot will not be easy. Minnesota already has several defensive linemen who appear firmly positioned ahead of him. Players such as Levi Drake Rodriguez, Cale Banks, Jalen Redmond, Tyron Ingram-Dawkins, and Dominique Gorn are expected to occupy significant roles within the defensive tackle picture. That means Ritzie's most immediate battle may be for developmental status rather than a Week 1 roster position. Yet Vikings fans know better than most that unexpected contributors can emerge from these situations. Not long ago, Jalen Redmond arrived with far less attention than established veterans. His story evolved into one of the most compelling developmental success stories on the roster. No one is claiming Ritzie will follow the same path, but the possibility alone makes him a player worth watching as training camp approaches. And what happened next inside the Vikings front office may be even more significant than any roster transaction. The organization made a move that quietly added years of NFL experience to its leadership structure, a decision that reveals a great deal about how new general manager Nolan Teasley intends to operate moving forward. What does the arrival of former Bears general manager Ryan Pace really tell us about Teasley's long-term vision for the Vikings? Comment below with your thoughts, because that front office decision could end up shaping Minnesota's future just as much as any player acquisition. One front office decision may have received far less attention than the roster moves and free agency spending totals, but it could ultimately have a bigger impact on the future of the Minnesota Vikings than many fans realize. The Vikings have officially brought in former Chicago Bears general manager Ryan Pace as a football advisor, and when you look closely at everything happening around new general manager Nolan Teasley, a very clear pattern starts to emerge. This isn't a random hire. This isn't simply adding another name to the organizational chart. This looks like a deliberate effort to surround a first-year general manager with as much NFL experience as possible. According to the information discussed, Teasley has been aggressively building out his football operations department since taking over the position. Along with Ryan Pace, the Vikings also added Am Capedia, a former Seahawks executive, as assistant director of pro scouting. The front office continues to grow, and the common theme behind these additions is experience. Think about the situation from Teasley's perspective. Running an NFL franchise is one of the most demanding jobs in professional sports. Every decision carries enormous consequences. Free agent contracts, draft selections, trades, practice squad moves, coaching support, salary cap management, every area can dramatically impact the direction of the franchise. Rather than attempting to handle everything alone, Teasley appears determined to build a structure that allows him to gather information from people who have already lived through those challenges. Ryan Pace certainly qualifies. Before becoming general manager of the Bears, Pace spent more than a decade with the Saints organization, working his way through scouting and personnel roles before eventually becoming director of player personnel. That experience exposed him to multiple roster-building philosophies and some of the NFL's most successful organizational processes. His tenure in Chicago produced mixed results, and Bears fans would certainly have opinions about some of the moves he made there. But regardless of those debates, nobody can deny that Pace has extensive experience operating inside NFL front offices. After leaving Chicago, he joined the Atlanta Falcons as vice president of football operations before now arriving in Minnesota as a senior advisor. And that may be exactly what Teasley wants. One of the most revealing parts of this entire development came from Teasley's own comments regarding leadership and decision-making. He described his greatest strength as the ability to gather information from people with different areas of expertise, process that information, and then build decision-making systems around it. That philosophy becomes much easier to understand when you examine the moves he's making behind the scenes. He's not building a front office centered around one voice. He's building one centered around multiple perspectives. Former general managers, experienced scouts, personnel executives, analytical minds, pro-scouting specialists. The goal appears to be creating an environment where every major decision is challenged, analyzed, and refined before becoming final. Whether that approach leads to victories remains to be seen. Results are always the ultimate judge in the NFL. But, from a process standpoint, there is a clear strategy unfolding. And while the front office continues evolving, another storyline is quietly gaining momentum on the field. If there is one undrafted rookie generating genuine excitement, it might be wide receiver Dillon Bell. Among all the undrafted free agents Minnesota brought in, Bell is emerging as perhaps the most intriguing candidate to force his way onto the final roster. According to the discussion surrounding his off-season performance, Bell has already been attracting attention during minicamp and OTA activities. What makes him particularly interesting is his versatility. Rather than being limited to a traditional receiver role, Bell has demonstrated the ability to line up in multiple locations across an offense. He can work from the slot. He can align outside. He can move into the backfield. He can create opportunities after the catch. That versatility led some evaluators to compare elements of his game to Deebo Samuel, a player known throughout the NFL for his ability to impact games from multiple positions. The comparison does not mean Bell will become the next Deebo Samuel, but it does illustrate the type of skill set he brings to the table. And perhaps most importantly, Bell appears to fit exactly the kind of player offensive coaches love to experiment with. Creative offensive coordinators are constantly searching for players who can stress defenses in unconventional ways. Jet sweeps, motion packages, screen plays, backfield alignments, slot mismatches, special teams contributions. Bell potentially offers value in all those areas. The path to making the roster is still difficult. Minnesota already has established receivers expected to occupy the top spots on the depth chart. The battle for the final receiver positions will be intense, with several players competing for limited opportunities. Yet Bell continues generating positive reports. And every summer, there is usually one player who arrives with little national attention before becoming the surprise story of training camp. Could Dillon Bell become that player? It's far too early to know, but he's rapidly becoming someone Vikings fans should keep a close eye on as training camp approaches. Now, when you step back and connect all these developments together, an interesting picture emerges. The Vikings spent the least money in free agency. They targeted value instead of splash signings. They continue searching for developmental talent through low-risk roster additions. They strengthened the front office with experienced executives, and they are already identifying potential hidden gems among undrafted players. Those are not the actions of a franchise chasing headlines. Those are the actions of a franchise attempting to build sustainable success through process, evaluation, and long-term planning. The real question is whether this strategy will produce the results fans are desperate to see. Will the bargain approach outperform the expensive one? Will Ryan Pace's experience help accelerate Nolan Teasley's development as general manager? And can an undrafted player like Dillon Bell become one of the biggest surprises of the upcoming season? That's where the conversation becomes fascinating. Let me know in the comments. Which of these stories interests you the most? The Ryan Pace hire, the new roster additions, or Dylan Bell's chances of making the team. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay locked in for more Minnesota Vikings coverage as we continue tracking every development heading into the season. SKOL!